All right, so our next keynote speaker, Diane Marsh, is a director of engineering at Netflix, where her team is in charge of the continuous integration, delivery, and deployment tools for their Amazon Web Services. Her team does a lot of cool stuff, managing everything from, well, lots of tools, basically, used both internally and externally across basically everybody in the organization, and a lot of open source stuff, too. You know, very cool that they're able to open source as much as they do. She is also the co-author of Atomic Scala, and is going to be talking to us today about engineering velocity, continuous delivery at Netflix. So please join me in welcoming Diane Marsh.
Thanks, it's great to be here. So before I get started, I wanted to find out a little bit about you guys. Most people are architects, right? How many people traveled to get here? Wow, lots of people. How many first time in Portland? Wow, what do you guys think? Yeah? So I've been to Portland now for the last 3 years in a row, and I have to say this is the first time I actually got to taste a voodoo donut. They're famous, and so I hope you guys got to try those out at the reception last night. I think the organizers did a really great job of being able to bring in that local flavor, because if you try to go to Voodoo Donuts, there's a line out the street, you know, down the road. It's crazy. And I thought, why is this so exciting, right? I'm not really a big donut fan, but they were really good. What do you think? Yeah? Yeah? Anyways, also before I get started, I want to give a quick shout out to the open spaces. I know that the organizers are trying to really bootstrap bringing open spaces to this conference format. I think it's a great idea, and I think that what it does is gives all of you the opportunity to start those conversations that you've been thinking about, and you've been sitting quietly saying, I wish somebody would just talk about this topic. And so it gives you and I an opportunity to get up, to talk about that topic, to start and engage on that topic. You don't have to know anything about it. You can just put up a little sticky note that says, hey, I want to talk about, you know, what's a way for me to get my kids into computer science? It doesn't have to be highly technical. I saw some on the board yesterday that were really just fun in nature. So I know it ends early this afternoon, but if you have a chance, go over and check out the Open Spaces board, because I think that it's a really great opportunity just to see what, you know, to add another layer to the conference. So anyhow. So let's get started. First, I have to find the clicker. Oh, here it is. OK, good. So I'm Diane Marsh. I am the Director of Engineering for Engineering Tools at Netflix. What does that mean? It means that we build the tools that the other developers, other teams use at Netflix for build, bake, and deploy to the cloud. OK? So we're going to talk about all of those in a little bit more detail. But what I want to give you a sense for is not really what I do. I'm going to give you a sense for how you can impact the organizations that you work in to increase your velocity. So when I talk about velocity, engineering velocity, what I want to say is the active participation in engineering velocity. So putting our weight behind making velocity happen, increasing it across our organization. So I'm going to take you through a journey of what we've done and what we're doing to increase velocity at Netflix. But I want you, and the journey is going to be around continuous delivery, because that's what my team does. But what I want you to think about is, if continuous delivery doesn't impact you directly, what can you do? You know, what's in your wheelhouse that you can impact your organization by increasing velocity at work, right? You might be able to use some of these tools. You might not be able to. But the real key message is, what can you do to improve velocity? So we talk about availability and rate of change, right? We want to have a highly available service. When you guys have a few minutes and you sit down and you want to watch a movie on Netflix, I want that service to be running. I want it to be up and running and give you that free time that that you've been looking for. But I also want to be able to push changes out quickly. I want to be able to provide, new features to our customers and be able to have that happen very quickly and rapidly. But as the rate of change increases, the availability can decrease, right? We all know that this happens. We're moving really quickly, and we may introduce problems into the system. So what we're trying to think of is a way, how can we increase our our rate of change and our availability at the same time. Have our cake and eat it too. Well, so what we're talking about is how can we shift that curve? How can we actually introduce something that allows us to get off of that blue curve and onto the gray curve? What can we do to actually go from 3 nines to 4 nines, or 2 nines to 3 nines, but without slowing down, without stopping our developers and saying, let's test this all much more carefully before you push it out? Okay? So think about what you can do in your organization to shift the curve as I'm talking about what we're doing. So if I talked about tooling at Netflix and I didn't talk about culture at Netflix, I'd be leaving out a really big aspect about how we're able to do the things that we do. So we have a freedom and responsibility slide deck that you can see on SlideShare. Talks all about the culture at Netflix and about what things that we think are really important. And the underlying principle of this is freedom and responsibility. Developers, managers, people at Netflix have great freedom to make the choices and changes and introduce things that they want to introduce. But they also have the responsibility to make sure that that's a good choice for their team, for themselves, for the company as a whole. Act in Netflix's best interest. Okay? So that kind of makes sure that we're thinking about things in the right way. I can choose the programming language that I want to introduce for my service. I can switch from JVM-based languages and introduce Python. And in fact, one of my coworkers did this. But if I'm going to do that, the infrastructure that we have around JVM-based languages for building services and deploying them to the cloud is already there. If I'm going to introduce Python, I have to take responsibility for bringing that infrastructure in as well. So it's not a free ride. This doesn't say I can make any changes I want. I can introduce chaos. It means that if I want the freedom to be able to introduce change, I have to take responsibility along with that freedom. This freedom extends across much of the organization. You've probably heard about things from vacation policy to how we do our deployments. And I'm going to talk about the deployments in more detail. We can talk about culture for a really long time, but I really want to make sure that you understand that the culture that we have at Netflix is one of the reasons why we're able to move so fast. Okay? As you watch the things that we're doing, and I talk about the things that we're doing, consider whether you can introduce those into your organization and whether the organization would have to change in order to be able to accept those things, or whether the tooling would have to change in some way in order to be able to cause that effect. And since the tools that I'm going to talk about are in open source, that's actually available to you. So what's a manager's role? A manager's role at Netflix is to manage by context, not control. I have the best job ever. I don't have to look at timesheets. I don't have to approve expense reports. I don't tell people what to do or when to do it or how to do it. What I do is make sure that I tell my team what's going on, give them context about what's going on in the rest of the company. And then I let the rest of the company know what my team is doing. Okay? So that everybody has the information that they need in order to make good choices for Netflix. So we talk about our teams being loosely coupled but tightly aligned. So we need that alignment so that we don't have chaos. But we need to have the teams that are free to innovate on their own so that we can actually make nice changes and have disruptive change in the industry. And one of my other responsibilities is to hire well. I need to bring in a great team to do these things. So we hire top talent. We work really hard to bring in people that raise the bar for our team, for our company, in areas that aren't already satisfied on the team. What else? What's my other responsibility? To get out of the way. My team members, I hired them for their expertise. I need to use that, right? If I tell them what to do, if I try to manage them by control, or if I try to dictate how we designed something, then I'm getting in their way. There are a lot more of them than there are of me. And they have some really great ideas. And so let's democratize that process. Let's let those guys, those men and women, make decisions every single day that are in their wheelhouse, the decisions that they've been hired to do. And let's get out of their way and let them have this freedom to innovate. I'm going to tell you a little story about experimentation, right? So you're not going to get innovation unless you have freedom to experiment. So one of the teams at Netflix said, hey, so we deploy our services to the cloud, and they scale. We use Amazon's reactive auto-scaling for scaling up when we need to have more instances running. So maybe at peak viewing times, things like that. And this works pretty well, but it always lags, right? Because the way the Amazon scaling engine works is you provide some metrics around which to indicate that you should scale up your service. But it always has to lag when you actually needed that to happen. It takes a while to spin up these instances, get them running, and actually accommodate this gap in the performance that you were looking for with auto-scaling. So this team said, what if we build a predictive auto-scaling engine? We have this really predictable pattern of use, right? You guys know, you always watch TV probably about the same time during the day, right? It's not that unpredictable. Right? So there's peak viewing hours. So let's figure out what that curve looks like. Let's keep some metrics about that curve, and let's see if we can build that into an auto-scaling engine that can predict and spin those instances up sooner, so that we have capacity ready when we need it, not shortly after we needed it. And so some other teams at Netflix were thinking, I don't know if this is going to work. Is it going to be as good? Is this even going to make sense? But they have the freedom to experiment, and they did. And it's worked really, really well. And there's a blog post about it on our tech blog. Unfortunately, you can't see it on the slides, but we're sharing the slides anyway. So you can see the write-up about how we're using the predictive auto-scaling engine and learn more about that. But the take-home message is, really remember that your team wants to innovate. They want to experiment. What we don't want to do is prematurely optimize. Right? So in that sense, we kind of go on one extreme for premature optimization. We really, really don't worry about it, about streamlining services. So, for example, if you need a tool, go ahead and build it, right? Don't worry that somebody else in the company may be building it as well. I mean, you might want to coordinate with them a little bit to know what they're doing and make sure that you're adding value on top of that. But if it doesn't meet your needs and they don't have the capacity to build what you need, then go ahead and build it yourself. And then that ultimately gets rolled up into the tooling that the rest of the company uses if it works. If it doesn't, you've gone off on an experimentation path and you've probably learned something. And there's benefit in that as well. And some of the tools that we're using in engineering tools are a result of one of our customer teams building a really great continuous delivery platform and us being able to bring that into the mainstream, bring that into the tooling that the rest of the company can use, productizing it essentially. And in order to support experimentation and innovation, you really need a blameless culture. So I'll tell you a story about the blameless culture. When I first joined Netflix, it's probably within the first couple of, maybe the first month or so, we had an outage. It affected some viewers. And some of my friends were emailing me because they knew I had just joined the company, and they said, can you fix this? You know, I can't watch my movie, and I really want to watch it tonight. And of course, I didn't actually. That wasn't really what I do. But I thought, hey, you know, we have these incident reviews whenever we have an outage that impacts customers. I'm going to go to the incident review, and I'm going to see how we handle blame in this company. Because we talk about a blameless culture, but I really want to make sure that these values that we talk about in our culture deck are the ones that we're really living. I'm a new employee. I want to make sure I knew what I got myself into, right? So I went to this incident review, and what I noticed happens in a blameless culture is that everybody raises their hand. Everybody realizes that they had some part in contributing to the problem that happened. So yes, the guy that made the actual change that caused the outage, right? He said, hey guys, I shouldn't have made this change. Here's what I'm going to do to remedy the situation. My team, my tooling team said, you know, we bear some responsibility here too. We should have built tooling that gave you more visibility into what you were doing so that you weren't blindly making a choice, you know, making this bad choice. And so this went on through the entire meeting. Nobody went out of there getting fired. Nobody went out of there feeling bad. Everybody went out of there with action items about how they can make change that improve the future rather than feeling bad about the past. And so that's, again, how we're going to shift the curve, right? We're going to increase availability while in light of making these changes in innovation by building into the tooling support for things that make it harder to make a bad choice without knowing what you're doing, right? and for making it really okay to make mistakes. We know that we're running really fast. We know that we're running with scissors, and every once in a while we're going to get hurt. What's really important is how fast we recover, not the fact that we got there in the first place. A lot of you work in companies that are, on the more critical path, right? People could die if you make a mistake. That's a really different culture, right? We are in a creative, inventive area. So we have some freedom and flexibility in how we're doing things that not all of you might experience. And I want to make sure that I give a nod to that because it's really important. It's really important to recognize that. So let's talk about how we do this. So we're going to start talking about the delivery process.
At Netflix, developers deploy their own code. You've probably heard articles about this, you've read articles about this, heard news about sort of this DevOps organization, right? In fact, I just read an article in Information Week. When I got here, I saw it was from January. There's a special episode or a special article on DevOps. And there's an article in Information Week about how the DevOps culture and how developers actually can and do deploy their own code. And that is what happens at Netflix. So we have lots and lots of services. We're building microservices. So developers are responsible for the service that they build. They're responsible for deploying it. They're responsible for deciding when to deploy it. They're responsible for testing it. And they're responsible for watching it in production to make sure that what they introduce doesn't cause any problems. So how does this make sense, right? Well, the good news is that the person who made the change is the person who knows what they did, right? They're in the best position to fix it if a problem happens. So that helps us to rapidly detect and rapidly respond to problems, right? It also means that we're not waiting on a QA team or on an ops team to push that code out to production. We can get that out there really soon. And so you guys know how it is, right? You make some changes to your service. You throw it over the wall, and it's gone to you, right? You're done making that change. Your brain is off working on other problems in a traditional culture. When the ops guys come to you and they say, ooh, there's a problem in the service, you might be 2 or 3 problems beyond that. So this way, when you're deploying your own code, you're testing it in production, you know what you just changed. Your brain is there, right? So if you need to make a fix, you're still in the moment of the changes that you made. So that's how we get freedom and responsibility out of deploying our own code. We have the freedom to deploy it. We have the responsibility to make sure that we make good choices. If I want to deploy my code at 2 in the morning, that's fine. But I'm the one who's going to get called at 2 in the morning to fix it, right? So lots of choices around that. And how is this not chaos? We have developers delivering and deploying their own code. How is this not chaos? Well, we're supporting it with tools. Right? We are not saying, sure, go ahead, define your own process, deploy your own code, see you later. That wouldn't be very responsible.
So they can develop their own deployment processes if they see fit. We have some teams that have done that because they have slightly different needs than what the mainstream does. But for the most part, what we want to do is support these teams so that when they push out a change, they have visibility about what they pushed, they have an easy way to roll it back, and they have support all along the way. So again, rapid innovation, rapid release cycle. All of these tools that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail are Netflix open source, and so you can use them, you can adapt them to your needs. So talk a little bit about Jenkins.
How many of you use Jenkins in your operations? Yeah, lots of people use Jenkins for continuous integration. Lots of other people use it for part of their delivery flow.
Is anybody using it for part of their jobs toward continuous delivery? Yeah, some people are doing that as well. So they use it kind of as an execution engine. The Jenkins Job DSL is not a Netflix open source project, but it is an open source project. One of the guys on my team went to a conference and with a couple of other people decided to address a problem. It's not that much fun writing Jenkins jobs. And developers like to write code. So let's give the developers a scripting language to write their Jenkins jobs in. Let's let them treat that
configuration as code. Let's check in those scripts so
so that we have them for later, for posterity, so we know what's actually running out there, right? So the Jenkins Job DSL is a manifestation of that. You can find this out on GitHub if you want to use it. Like I said, it's not connected to open source, to Netflix open source, but we're using it actively. We're contributing to it, and we're finding a lot of value in it. Aminator. So it's not a typo, it really is aminator. So amination evidently is a process that makes things. And so the aminator is our representation of wanting to build something that's reliable and repeatable as an object of deployment. So what we do for amination is we create a base image, a base AMI. So AMIs are Amazon Machine Images. This is the unit of deployment in the AWS cloud. But we want a base image that reflects what most of the teams at Netflix actually need. The operating system, the services that are common to most of the teams at Netflix. We're going to build that layer, right? And then when you make a change to a service, we're going to layer your changes on top of that base image. We're going to bake that, we call it baking, into one new AMI. And that's the AMI that we're going to deploy. This is the object of deployment. We're going to deploy it to both test and to production. How does this increase our availability? Well, it makes sure that what we're putting out in test is the same as what we're putting out in production. So it gives us an opportunity to test in two different environments. It also gives us a great awareness of what's running in production because we know which base image was used. And we can clearly say this did or did not include this bug or this part of the operating system that needed to be patched or whatever, right? So it gives us an understanding about what's in production, that visibility. The Aminator open source project, I included this little logo on the bottom for our Netflix open source projects, and the Aminator is one of those. It is written with abstracting cloud details. So while we use it for AWS, other people use it for other cloud providers, and the Aminator itself does abstract away those details. Asgard. How many people have heard of Asgard? So I'll bring your awareness to Asgard. Asgard is a deployment tool. This is a tool that would have been great if Amazon would have written. It's a way for us to deploy our services to the Amazon cloud. It's what we use. Most of the teams at Netflix use this. And we use a notion called RedBlack Push. And I'm going to explain that in a little bit more detail. But first I'm going to tell you a story about why we developed Asgard. So a couple of years ago, we had a small team that was experiencing a lot of problems with their service. It was, they're in a rapid state of innovation. They're pushing out changes a lot. And when the service was not working, it took a really, really long time to get it back up, like on the order of an hour, right? That's a long time. And the team was getting stressed out and pretty upset, right? Because it's really important to us to have a highly available service. And so 4 people sat down in a room and they said, we got to come up with a solution to this problem, guys. What are we going to do? And in the spirit of experimentation, they came up with Asgard. And they said, let's build a system that allows us to deploy to the cloud and roll back easily. Let's put this in the hands of the developers so developers can use this themselves. And let's see what happens. Let's see if we can increase our availability by innovating on this project. So here's what a RedBlack Push is. The RedBlack Push says we have a bunch of instances running in the cloud, right? We have a service that's up and running, a bunch of instances in this cluster running, everything's good. So if I want to make a change to it, sometimes, the truth is, sometimes we have to test in production, right? We've tried to test it in test, we've tried to test it in our integration server, but there's nothing like production for testing, right? We have the scale there, we have enough traffic, and sometimes we really need to push it out to production. So let's just inch out there with a change, right? So we got this running service, everything's going great. So let's spin up a whole new cluster. Let's just start one little instance over here. And let's start sending a little bit of traffic to it. Let's see what happens. Oh, we're going to measure that behavior with the canary analysis. Canary analysis, throw the canary in the coal mine and see if it dies. Well, A little bit more humane than that, we're going to put the service out there and see what happens. So we put the service out there, we start measuring those metrics. We're comparing them against this running service that everybody's using, everything looks great. Is it worse? Is it better? If it's worse, well, nothing to see here. Let's just keep moving on. But if it's better or if it's the same, let's spin up some more instances, okay? Let's use the cloud for what it actually is. It's this amazing opportunity to have lots and lots of servers, right? I'm not constrained by the data center. Let's not pretend that we are. So now, at some point, I may have twice as many instances running as I actually need because I've got my old service running. I've got this guy fully spun up, right? So now I've got twice as many instances running, taking traffic. I'm shifting traffic over to the new, and I'm turning off traffic to the old. So at some point, all the traffic's running over here on my new service, and I'm watching this. And I'm keeping up with my canary analysis and my metric to see if I should continue or not, or see if I should stop and turn traffic back on over here, and it's as if nothing happened, right? So the whole notion of the RedBlack push is let's keep these instances warm, right? We have the cloud, let's use it. Let's keep these instances warm with traffic just turned off, the new guy's running, and then if we have a problem, turn off traffic, turn on traffic, and we can go and fix the problem and come back later. Right? So this is a way to really just use what we need, what we know we need to do in the cloud. This solved a lot of our problems that we had in the past with availability because that long time it takes to spin up processes really impacts how fast it takes to recover from a problem. But now you've essentially removed that as an impediment. So that's really important, a really good thing to keep in mind. So we rolled out this change. It made a really big difference in our company. But that wasn't good enough, right? We want to take the lessons we learned from Asgard, from this, as I described, this spinning up, this RedBlack push. We want to take those lessons and we wanted to build an automated workflow so that you didn't have to keep track of what was going on throughout this entire process. And so that you could manage deployment to other regions as well. So we have multiple regions in the US and in the EU, and we want to be able to push out to those regions. And we want to manage this in a way that the developers don't have to think about it, right? We want developers focusing on the problems that they're trying to solve, right? The things that we paid them to do. We don't want them focusing on tooling. We don't want them worrying about, is it time for me to spin up a couple more instances and keep going? We want to automate as much as possible. So we wrote a library in Ruby called Glisten. It sits on top of Amazon Simple Workflow, which turns out is not that simple. And it encapsulates a lot of the difficulties associated with that workflow. Glisten provides the basis for our continuous delivery engine, right? More than just the automated RedBlack push, which it satisfies as a workflow. It also satisfies this taking code from build all the way through to production. And so we're building our continuous delivery platform on Glisten. And there's an article about Glisten on the tech blog, which again you can't read. And Glisten is also Netflix open source. So we also built this notion of judges between stages. So you have stages in your continuous delivery platform. You say, I want to progress from build to deploying in a different region, to spinning up all kinds of different levels of granularity, right? But I want to put a judge in there that says, do I want to move from stage to stage? Why do I do that? Lots of reasons, right? I want to be able to give teams flexibility to define what's working. What metrics am I using to decide to move to widen the instances that I'm running in production? What metric am I using to decide whether I want to go to another region? So I'm going to build this into judges. But it also has an unintended side effect. In judges, we support the notion of a manual judge. So this might be an email message or a hip chat indication that I want that my workflow to continue. This supports our teams that aren't as far along in their continuous delivery journey as other teams are. We have some teams that are pushing out several times a day. We have some teams that push out several times a month. Several times a week, several times a month. And some that are still trying to figure out, how every few months they're going to push. And so by adding this manual judge in the way, we give those teams the ability to jump onto a continuous delivery pipeline without having to fully adopt the entire continuous delivery platform. Okay? So this is a way to give them that increased repeatability and reliability that the other teams are getting, but not completely bury them in work. Okay? So we want to be really aware of the tax we're imposing on our client teams.
And have it show up in production, even if I have really great gates along the way.
Even if I have really great gates along the way, maybe. So maybe not. Our developers know their services better than anyone else. They are in the best position to be able to make that decision about how safe is my continuous delivery pipeline. How much do I trust those judges along the way? Do I want it to go all the way out to production? Sure, maybe I do. Maybe I don't. Maybe I want to have a manual gate between test and production. Do I want it to go to multiple regions?
I sure don't want to introduce a change that I put in US East and it goes all the way through to US West and the EU all at the same time and impacts everybody globally, right? I don't want to do that. But I know my service, right? So I assess.
But I know my service. Right? So I assess whether that's a good thing to be able to push out to all regions at the same time, or whether it's something I don't want to do. So it's an individual decision. It depends a lot on what the changes that I made. It depends a lot on what I know about the impact that my service has. So how do I want to manage that? Our tooling supports the best practices, gives you an ability to be able to control this yourself, limits the impact of human error. So let's make you acknowledge that you're pushing it out to multiple regions. Let's maybe not make that the default. But we don't want to prevent it either. So why don't we want to prevent it? Can anybody think why we might not want to prevent this? Well, you might have an emergency fix, right? Something it's bad. It's bad. It's out there. It's bad. This can't be worse. Well, maybe it can, but it's not likely to be. So let's push to all regions at the same time because we have an emergency fix. I don't want my tooling to be an impediment. I don't want it to get in the way of availability, right? So in this case, I want my innovation to be pushed out there immediately, and I think that it's actually going to improve my availability. Maybe I want to do canary testing per region. Maybe I don't. Again, freedom and responsibility, make good choices for yourself, for your service, but it's up to you. But let's encourage the best practices in the tooling, but not enforce limitations. So I talked about regional isolation, but we also have to balance this with.
I don't want them to diverge for too awful long, right? As a developer, I don't want to think about what regions do I have that service deployed in, which ones have I not updated yet. I want my tooling to be able to manage that. So in the multi-regional isolation, I said I wanted to stagger pushes between regions. For multi-region consistency, I might want to have tooling that's scheduled to my deployments. I don't want to think about, let's see, it's 9:30.
I don't want to think about, let's see, it's 9:30. So probably not a good time to push something to the EU, right? But maybe it's fine time to push it to the East Coast, fine time to push it to the West Coast. I don't want to have to be a time zone converter. I want the tooling to do that for me, right? And if we increase to more regions than what we already have, that becomes a really hard problem to solve for people, right? But it's a really great problem to solve for tooling. So let's let the tooling worry about things that tools are great about figuring out, like time zones. Let's
push a big change while you guys are all trying to watch a movie on Friday night. But our service, we may decide that it's fine, let's do it anyways, right?
It's fine, let's do it anyways, right? I want my tooling, like I said, to pick the next available region, but I also want it to tell me what's deployed where, so that I can assess what I'm doing and making sure that things are getting updated. So let's talk about the Simian Army. Who knows about the Simian Army? Yeah, the Simian Army was my first introduction to open source at Netflix. I had no idea the technology that came out of this company until I met the Chaos Monkey.
The latency monkey, the conformity monkey, and the janitor monkey are parts of the Simian Army. So we have other images up here, other monkeys that work together, and then we have a gorilla. And
And they all work to basically simulate things that happen in the cloud anyways, right? Bad things happen in the cloud. Right. Bad things happen in the cloud. It's a fact of life. You can do one of two things. You can basically pretend it's not going to happen, feel very optimistic that your service is not going to get, an instance isn't going to get shut down when you scale down, but it will. So better to have that happen in a controlled circumstance where we can actually address and understand the problems and log and know what's going on than to have it just happen to you, right? So these tools were built specifically for availability, specifically for addressing problems that happen in production that we want to anticipate and make sure that we understand so that they don't have impact on our availability. I'll talk about them in a little bit more detail. Near and dear to my heart. I come from a distributed processing background. When we were testing distributed systems way back when, we turned computers off, right? See what happens. Is it resilient? We turned computers off, right? See what happens. Is it resilient to that failure? The Chaos Monkey, just a lot more meaningful than that. We can do some logging, and it's a little bit more humane, right? It kills some instances in production. It's running now. It runs during business hours in production while our engineers are there to deal with any problems that happen. But honestly, it runs so much, and we've all become accustomed to writing services that are resilient to the Chaos Monkey that we don't think about it very often. Okay. If anything, it's something that runs out there to keep us honest, right? The cloud, and like I said, it does run in production. The latency monkey. This is harder, right? Latency between services is harder than failure. So we want to, but it happens, right? It happens. So we want to, but it happens, right? It happens in the cloud, and it's something you have to deal with. So let's build our services in a way that they can be resilient to latency. So the latency monkey introduces latency between services and helps us to figure out. It doesn't do anything active about helping us solve the problem. But it brings awareness to our developers that it's a problem we need to solve. To continuous delivery, the conformity monkey tells us, like I said before, I want to know when my deployment's diverged. I want to apply a bunch of rules and have the conformity monkey tell me if those things are going on. So remember, I said we worked in an environment of context. I said we worked in an environment of context, not control, right? So I don't go to you and say, you're not following the practices that we set forth, and that's a little bit risky. What I do is I run the conformity monkey on your service, and it tells you what's going on, and helps you to understand the changes that you need to make in order to make yourself resilient to. We're going to build those best practices into our tooling and reporting. So remember I talked before about staging our deployments? Well, I don't want to send harassing emails. Well, I don't want to, send harassing emails to you saying, your service is out of date in the EU, when in fact, of course it is, because we're running a test in the other regions, and so why am I, abusing you about this? So I want to build that balance between regional consistency and regional isolation into my tooling, and the understanding that this is something that happens. So give us some good defaults, and only bother you when it's really a problem. I don't want developers worrying about the intricacies of running a cloud environment. We have businesses spinning up all the time. Stuff gets left running out there that we're not using, right? Stuff gets left running out there that we're not using, right? And we don't want to incur that cost either. So the janitor monkey has some rules that it understands about what we're using in the cloud and goes and cleans up after us, right? It doesn't mean we don't want to clean up after ourselves, but it's actually that nice stopgap measure to make sure that we're not paying for services that we don't need and we don't use. So we talked a lot about shifting the curve with tooling. Value self-service, pushing this to the developers, pushing this out so that we can test everywhere, supporting this multi-region environment in a way that developers don't have to be always aware and vigilant about what we're doing in multiple regions. Make it simple for them. Support the best practices in tooling, and recover quickly and easily, right? Most of all the ones in cloud native. Remember what I said, we're using the cloud for what it offers us. We're understanding the inherent dangers in the cloud with things. We're understanding the inherent dangers in the cloud with things, with instances going away, seemingly at random. But we're also using it for this ability to be able to spin up instances and be able to not be constrained by the number of servers we have in our data center. So we want to really embrace the cloud architecture. But we can't do this without our culture. The tooling that we've built. We would never have built Asgard if we didn't have the need for developers to be able to push out their own code. Right? Some companies use it where an ops team pushes out. Some companies use it where an ops team pushes out code and it's restricted to that ops team. We don't have restrictions on who uses Asgard at Netflix, right? So we would have built the tooling perhaps in a different way if we were thinking about the culture differently, if we weren't thinking about how developers are actively engaged in the deployment process. We really, really respect. It takes a lot of courage to be able to suggest something that's totally off the wall, like the predictive auto-scaling engine, and have your peers like the predictive auto-scaling engine, and have your peers say, I don't know, is that going to work, right? But the peer groups are pretty resilient to that. Everybody knows that we're free to experiment, and so it wouldn't have been a situation where people would have been made fun of if it hadn't worked, right? Instead, it was, hey, that was a great idea. Let's see if there's something else we can do here. We certainly learned something from that experience. But instead, it was wildly successful. So that's great, too. It's learning of a different way. Fundamentally, this blameless culture, like I said, where we're all thinking about what can I do to improve the availability of my service? What can I do to increase engineering velocity in light of the fact that I want to make sure that we have a highly available service? So I'm bringing the sensibility of tooling because that's my area of expertise. Other people are bringing the sensibility of auto-scaling because that's their area of expertise. So if the entire company is striving toward shifting that curve and making a highly available service, even as we increase our pace of innovation, that's when we're actually going to make a difference. So I'm going to close with an example of how Asgard was used not outside of Netflix. You ended up using Asgard for deploying their services to AWS. They got to the point where they had so many services that they used Asgard to deploy out to the cloud. And probably took a lot of courage for somebody at Amazon or at Obama's team to come up with this idea. Let's use this open source project to deploy to the cloud. At a time when it wasn't really all that well known. So somebody, knew about it, right? So they were out there in the industry knew about it, right? So they were out there in the industry looking at open source projects, trying to figure out what they could use. So they brought the awareness of the tool back to the team, and they said, let's try it. And they used it for deployment. And so, hey, it worked for them. They're in a completely different culture than what we're in. But it's an example of how we can use the tooling outside of Netflix. There are about 44 projects, I think, now on netflix.github.com. They range from the tools that I described today to platform tools, to services, to data tools, analysis tools. Basically, the culture at Netflix has supported the fact that we can put our projects out in open source if they're not on the mainstream of the IP of the company, right? So we're not going to put stuff out there that helps our competitors stream things, right? But we're perfectly happy to put out our build tools, our platform components, things that just make the cloud better. So why do we do this? We do this for a couple of reasons. One, it really builds Netflix awareness as a technology company, right? So because all these tools are out there, and you can see how we're innovating in the open. So all these projects, people ask me, are you releasing them to open source? And does what's used internally, does that vary from what you see in open source? No, in most of these cases, we're actually developing in the open as well as open source. So when our internal teams get a feature, the open source community gets that feature as well, because it's one repository in GitHub. So I want to thank you all for coming. Happy to answer any questions. I hope that some of these tools will be useful to you, but more than anything, I hope that what you're leaving today with is a sense for how you can increase velocity at your company, either through some of these techniques, some of the cultural changes, some of the tools, if that's applicable. So thank you very much.
Thanks, that was very useful. A lot of the tools you mentioned seem to assume that the services don't have a state. So when you talk about rolling back, about having two different instances, so is that because Netflix doesn't have much state, or is that you have ways to deal with that as well?
So a lot of our services are stateless. The vast majority are. We do have a data team that uses Cassandra extensively, and they are happy to announce that they are now Chaos Monkey compliant. So they can withstand a Chaos Monkey attack on the Cassandra team. That was a really big deal.
But do they use these tools for deployment?
They do use these tools for deployment, yep. They use it in a slightly different way. Their rollout is much slower than the other teams, and they have to manage their state. So instead of that rollout happening over a few minutes to an hour, that rollout might happen over a week. And so it's more of a rolling than a RedBlack push.
So do you have more controls for them?
We do have support for them as well. Yep. Mm-hmm. And it's all in the Asgard tool itself. So it's all available in open source. That tooling is as well. But I think that they've built some practices around how they actually move their state around that support that sort of externally to the tool.
Hi, you mentioned RedBlack deployment using Asgard, and I was wondering, you have a lot of small services. Can they all deploy at once, or do you need to have one service deploy Canary and then go to the next one?
So we don't control a lot of things at Netflix, and so we don't really have any control over how many services are deploying at once. People deploy their service when they see fit. So yeah, we can withstand many services going out at the same time.
I'm worried about information overload from a developer's perspective. So I'm sitting there as a developer, and I find out that there are half a dozen new tools with 6 new features on each tool. Can I handle that? Is that a problem, or how do you manage that?
The shiny object syndrome, where I'm grabbing at shiny objects. Is that what you're worried about? How do we handle that? So,
well, not so much that. It's just understanding what all is going on in my environment.
Yeah. So I recently, back to the freedom and responsibility argument. I recently told the other server engineering managers that I wanted to make a lot of changes in our tooling this year, right? So I'm putting a burden on them. I'm saying, we're going to upgrade our version control. We're going to upgrade our build system. We're going to upgrade our deployment tool. We're updating Asgard. And by the way, we're going to go from CentOS-based images to Ubuntu-based images. So you're all good with that, right? That would have probably gotten eggs or tomatoes thrown at me, But instead, so my job, remember, is context, not control. So I went to the other managers, and I gave them context about my team. And I said, here are how these changes will help us to go faster, which will help you go faster, right? But I understand there's a cost. So what I've done is I've spun up another team. I've spun up a migration team. And with the freedom and responsibility, I have full control over my hiring process. So I can hire the people that I need. I can define a whole new team if that's what I need. So I hired a team to help our teams migrate from old tools to new tools, to share the burden with our customers, and to actually bear that tax with them so that we're able to learn from the individual teams and build some of that into our tooling to make it easier for teams that come later, but also to share some of that migration cost so that they don't throw eggs at me.
So is it fair to characterize that as a modern version of training the help center?
Training the help center, sure, except in this case they're developers. Yeah. But yeah, we definitely need to, I said we value self-service. We totally do. I do not want to be responsible for people's builds. I don't want to be responsible for their build scripts. I don't want to be responsible for their deployments. We just don't scale. You know, we have a lot of engineers at Netflix, and my team isn't that big. Even if we wanted to, we wouldn't be able to support the company in that way. We would basically just be introducing that same bottleneck that ops teams have in the past. So my goal with the migration team is to leave teams in a self-sufficient state, to be able to train them about what they need to do to use this tooling. But at the same time, I want to build tooling that fades in their consciousness, right? In the same way that you use an IDE and you don't really think about, hopefully, think about every single day how you're configuring your IDE. You just use it to get your work done. I want our tools to support our developers getting their work done rather than driving them to have very deep knowledge about the tooling.
You talked about a service being wrapped into an AMI and then deployed. Could you speak to the granularity of the service and maybe give examples of what you mean? I think different people here would have different examples of what you mean by service.
Sure. So a service is something that solves one problem, typically. We're building microservices, so we're not bundling a lot of functionality into a single service. So one example might be personalization. You know, how your viewing history is personalized when you see it. And so that's an example about a running service. We have libraries too, but I'm actually talking about services.
And that single one will go into, I think,
yeah, so it'll go into a cluster, which is a set of instances. So it may be typically more than one instance. One instance wouldn't be very resilient, but yeah, it'll go into a group of instances.
are you always running a single service on one instance?
Yes, a single service on one instance. So
I had just a quick question. What your standpoint from a tools perspective with your engineers when it comes to net neutrality seems to be a really hot topic right now. And I know that Netflix accounts for a good 20 to 30% of the internet traffic at any given time. And right now there's a lot of politics involved, et cetera. But from your standpoint within the company and your developers, et cetera, from a tool standpoint, what are your thoughts on net neutrality, having Netflix just recently entered into sort of your paid peering agreements with Comcast and Verizon, and just what is your sentiment on that?
yeah, my expertise is not in lawyer speak or negotiating contracts with ISPs. There is a lot out there on the internet that describes in great detail the steps that we're taking toward net neutrality. I think there was an article or a motion submitted yesterday by a bunch of companies that are interested in this problem, and we're signers on that motion. But my team is not directly impacted by net neutrality.
Question over here. Got it?
Can she? Yeah, the speakers make it really hard to figure out who's talking because I can hear it, but it's like the voice of.
So your company's been around since 1997, which I don't know if everyone realized that. When did you guys start creating this service-oriented architecture, and was it centrally planned, or was it an accident? What was the origin of the architecture?
Oh gosh, that predates me, but let's see if I can remember the history. So as we moved to the cloud several years ago, the service-oriented architecture took over. Before, we had one monolithic Java app that was running, and I think that it was broken down. I don't remember whether it was broken down before the movement to the cloud or whether the movement to the cloud sort of drove that implementation into microservices.
So I guess I have a question here.
Oh, good. Okay.
So just piggyback on this conversation is, how did you guys address the challenges of moving from your data centers into the cloud? Because I assume it's always on your shoulders pretty much, right? Or whoever was doing this, because it's required a lot of changes in the tooling and how you deploy and how you spread this amongst the instances, changing on architecture. So can you kind of speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, so there are a lot of people that are intricately involved in moving from the data center to the cloud. There was a very close collaboration between IT, supporting the data center, and engineering, which was in streaming, which is cloud-based. When that migration happened, they worked really closely together to make sure that that was a smooth process. We still have a few services that are running in the data center that we're migrating out to the cloud as we can. And so for the most part, everything's in the cloud now.
You've talked a lot about services to the cloud. What about your customer-facing apps that are actually deployed to devices? Do they follow similar processes for deployment, or?
So historically, my team has served the services layer, not the client teams and the product teams. We're increasing our scope to be able to help those teams as well. And so one of my goals for this year is to increase our scope so that we can reach out to those client teams. They do use a similar process, but even closer integration would be helpful for us.
Hello. You mentioned about the freedom to developers. Well, with that much amount of freedom, with a lot of developers and a lot of services, how do you manage communication with respect to changes that happen, in one area of the organization that one developer brings? You may have dependencies on that service that developer is changing, across other services that many others are maintaining. How do you manage that communication? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so we have some insight into how services are being used and who's using them and who's dependent on changes. And that communication happens in a pretty much one-on-one situation. So we do some broad context setting in big groups, but Netflix is really all about the person-to-person contact. There's a reason why we're all located in Los Gatos. Those water cooler conversations, those, hey, can we just grab a room and talk about this, happen all the time. And so we're managing a lot of different dependencies through this context setting. Certainly our REST APIs help us to set contracts about how we're communicating between services, but we also need to, when we're deprecating things especially, we need to be really clear about what our deprecation cycle looks like so that people aren't caught unaware.
Wait, one more. Maybe two more.
I really like what you have said about freedom and responsibility. And I'm asking myself, you say you have an idea to provide better service, you just spin up an additional team. And how does your company decide whether it's really worth it in money? You could spend a whole lot of money and provide even better service, but how does your company decide where's the best match?
Okay, so the question is, how does the company decide whether those decisions that we're making are good for Netflix, right? So are you talking about specifically with respect to hiring, or are you talking about a service that I might be providing, so a new feature that I'm adding to the software?
No, how does your company decide how much money or investment your service is worth? Your service as a department or unit?
Oh, like engineering tools in general? Oh, that's a really good question. So the really nice thing about Netflix is that I don't have to be intricately involved with budgets. But we have this sense that we are a high leverage team and that the changes that we implement in engineering tools help the other teams to be more productive across Netflix. And so from that standpoint, I haven't had any difficulty encouraging people to spend money on my team. But I think that there's also an interesting question about how do we decide if features go into the Netflix service, and you probably all know, we make extensive use of A/B testing. And so, one of the nice things about being able to innovate, deploy out really quickly is that we can deploy a lot of A/B tests to see what you respond to, what you do and don't like. And so we're constantly testing our features. We're bringing some of that testing, that notion, not really A/B testing, but we're bringing a lot of those metrics back into engineering tools to decide where we're providing value. So recently we did an analysis of Asgard, and we said, hey, so how are people using this tool? As we continue to invest in this tool, how much effort should we put into different features in the tool? And we found that 93% of the calls into Asgard are through the API, not through the GUI. So that means one of two things. It means either that our GUI is too hard to use, or that people are really making great use of the API. And so we're using that to sort of inform the decisions that we're making moving forward about how to invest in tooling.
One more?
Yeah. You mentioned something at the very beginning of the talk. You had the chart that showed the issues related to rate of change and availability, and how in many situations you've got some clear trade-offs, and I think you were saying you were trying to really go after a space where you have high availability and high rate of change. So I was just thinking here, when I go back, if I'm trying to talk to my boss or my boss's boss and I say, hey, you know, Netflix has this approach they're talking about that gets high availability and high rate of change, the questions I want to get are like, what's their secret sauce? Is it relevant for us? Do they have any quantified data? And I just want to see from it, I want to feed back what I think I heard, and then I had a couple questions.
Okay.
What I think I heard here was there's a set of things you're doing for rate of change. You hire really good people. You have a series of processes in place that encourage them to be able to explore things and to take ownership and responsibility of what they do. There's a good aspect about how that whole process goes. When it comes to the issues of high availability, it sounds to me like you're doing a few things here. One of them is like you do have some tools that you're running an old and new version. You have an easy way to be able to go back, which is often a problem that comes up with availability. The second thing is you have some approaches using like the Simian Army about it's known that these things are being run in the background, and it causes people to more proactively deal with their code knowing that this stuff is going to be run, so it helps to head some things off. And you have a culture where people are willing to accept responsibility and not play a blame game. I think that's a lot of what I heard were features, if I got it right. So I just want to see if I'm missing something or if I got it right. And then the questions I have for you, because these are the questions I'd get. Do you have any sense about, in any quantitative sense, about the kind of benefits that you're achieving in terms of availability by doing this stuff versus not? And also, if another organization in a different industry, you mentioned that you guys don't have the same criticality issues that some other places have, but a number of us are in situations where it would be more critical. If we were going to try to apply some of these ideas in our environment, which of the pieces do you think we'd be able to most effectively apply and leverage?
Okay, sounds good. So one, wow, great summary. I am so glad that you were able to articulate that so well, and I wish I could have done that. So awesome. Secondly, what tools can we pull out immediately? Asgard is a tool that basically provides a nice interface on top of AWS. I think you can use that at very low risk. You can use that in an organization that already has an ops culture where the ops people push out code. Because it would support that fast rollback. It would support the ability to be able to easily spin up clusters in the cloud without introducing the fact that developers deploy their own code. We use it that way. It doesn't mean you have to, and I think not everybody does. And in fact, our security team uses it in a very controlled environment as well. So what other tools? Aminator, again, building up this base image of reliable, repeatable components that you pre-package so that you know that you're testing the same thing in test and production. I think that's another open source tool that you could use. Lots of platform components that you can look at on our website. Discovery, which discovers, it's called Eureka, I think, in the open source world, which discovers what services are running out there and lets them talk to each other. So I look at all the platform components. What wouldn't you be able to use? I don't know. I'm drawing a blank on where the tooling would fall down. I think you might need to introduce some changes into Asgard to be able to support login and change control if that's important to you, because we don't have that. In there. We have login support, but we don't have a change control type of mandate. It's supported, but not enforced. And what was your other question? You had the first question.
Inevitably, I get these questions. They're hard for me to answer. I know, which is people are sometimes asking, can you quantify? Like, for instance, if you get better availability or better rates of change, is this like 5 or 10% or 50%? Or Do you have any thoughts about that in terms of the extent that you've seen benefits in either or both of those areas by applying these practices?
Sure. So we're a data-driven company. We do lots and lots of measurement, as you might expect. We have a great data sciences team that measures lots of stuff and gives us great feedback about what our availability looks like over time. And we can basically look at what we're doing from an availability standpoint. I don't think we've tied that back to the pace of innovation yet. So, and it may not be worth it, right? So if we achieve our 9s and we don't have to measure how that's impacted by innovation, then maybe we can focus our efforts on other things, and we can just say, yep, we're heading in the right place. But what I'm doing through our engineering velocity program is adding a lot of measurement so that we actually know how often we build, how often we deploy, how long those cycles take. What I'm trying to do is, like I said, increase the velocity, but it's also going to give me visibility into more metrics about how that process actually looks.
So Diane, we want to offer a token of our thanks. There's not tooling on this clock for time zone conversion, but it's going to look nice on your ledge. This is an SEI clock. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for being with us. Time for our break. Thank you.